HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands by Lytle Hernández, read by Joana Garcia. Introduction. We stand between. They lit the pyre and watched him burn. Antonio Rodriguez, a 20-year-old ranch hand, murdered a white woman, they said. White men from nearby farms formed a posse to track him down, while the other residents of Rock Springs, Texas, some 400 of them, met at the edge of town and piled kindling at the base of a mesquite tree. The posse soon arrived with a cowboy in the lead, dragging Rodriguez by a lasso looped around his neck. The mob laughed as they chained Antonio to the tree and doused him in kerosene. Someone threw a match, and 30 minutes later, when Antonio Rodriguez was dead, the residents of Rock Springs returned quietly to town and business was resumed. It was November 3, 1910. Mexican-American journalists in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands reported the grisly details of Rodriguez's murder, condemning it as an act of racial terror akin to the lynching of African Americans in the South. Newspapers in Mexico picked up the story. Lynching is not practiced by the blonde Yankee except upon beings whom, for ethnic reasons, he considers his inferiors, fumed the editors of the Mexico City paper El Debate. Another paper dubbed Anglo-Americans the barbarous whites of the North, deriding them as the giants of the dollar, but pygmies of culture. There is indignation among Mexicans here over this lynching, reported El País. By November 8th, riots had erupted across Mexico, targeting the considerable number of U.S.-owned businesses and homes. The protesters smashed windows and tore down American flags while chanting, "Mueran los Yankees," death to the Americans. The police arrested hundreds of people. In one case, officers drew sabers and descended upon a crowd, killing one man by stabbing him through the neck. The protests continued on the streets and in the press, prompting Henry Lane Wilson, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, to issue a public warning. The United States government will leave nothing undone to protect U.S. citizens and property in Mexico. It was a threat. The United States would invade Mexico if attacks on U.S. interests did not cease. The protests raged on. Ambassador Wilson decided to visit General Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico, to insist that he put a stop to the anti-American disturbances. Porfirio Diaz had ruled Mexico for 27 years. Seizing the Mexican presidency by coup d'etat in 1876, the general had thrown open the doors of his country, handing out land and tax incentives to foreign investors. He also guaranteed pliant labor. Tens of thousands of U.S. investors rushed in, ranging from the Rockefellers to one-pick miners, making Mexico the first country where U.S. citizens made significant foreign investment. U.S. citizens soon controlled key sectors of the Mexican economy: railroads, oil, and mining. By 1900, they owned 130 million acres, amounting to 1/4 of Mexico's arable land. By 1910, fully half of all money invested by Americans overseas, more than $500 million, went to Mexico, and they expected President Diaz to protect their interests. Diaz used foreign capital to industrialize the Mexican economy, often with little regard for the rights and well-being of Mexico's poorest citizens. When investors bought land claimed by Mexico's rural and indigenous communities, Diaz dispatched soldiers to evict any stragglers or protesters. Most notoriously, when the Yaqui refused to be removed from their homeland, Diaz deported the rebel fighters and their families to labor camps in the jungles of southern Mexico. When industrial workers protested the low wages and dangerous working conditions that prevailed at mines, mills, and factories, Diaz ordered troops to fire on the picket lines. In 1907, during a strike in Rio Blanco, Diaz's troops killed at least 50 picketers on a single morning. And across Mexico, Diaz maintained a deadly mobile strike force, the Rurales, to terrorize his regime's critics. The Rurales killed more than 10,000 people during Diaz's rule. With Diaz in charge, investors brimmed with confidence. Even as protesters filled the streets of Mexico after Antonio Rodriguez's lynching, President Taft quipped to his Secretary of State, "I cannot conceive of a situation in which President Diaz would not act with a strong hand in defense of just American interest." Still, the protests continued. After a week of conflict in the streets, Ambassador Wilson marched into the president's office in the National Palace to lodge a complaint. Diaz cut him off, informing the ambassador that he had already given the press strict orders to stop any further comments on the anti-American demonstrations, and that one of the journals which had disobeyed these instructions, namely El Debate, had been suppressed. When Wilson returned the next day, Diaz informed him that he had given orders to the authorities of the whole republic to act with the necessary energy to suppress any further agitation because of the Texas matter, and that if anything of the kind should happen again, those who participated in any demonstrations would be dealt with all the severity of the law. The Mexican government, Diaz confirmed, would stamp out the protests and censor the press, and everyone involved in the recent disturbances would be brought to account. But the root of the problem was not in Mexico, insisted Diaz. The problem was in the United States. There, across the border region, a large number of Mexicans were living in exile and openly planning a revolution against his rule. As Diaz put it, the riots in Mexico began only because two of those exiles, Francisco Madero and Ricardo Flores Magon, had taken advantage of the unfortunate affair which happened in Texas to excite young students and men of the laboring classes in order to discredit the government. Francisco Madero, one of Mexico's wealthiest men, had been in the United States for just a few months. As recently as June 1910, he had run against Diaz in the presidential election. But Diaz had had him arrested on charges of insulting the president and fomenting rebellion, and held him in custody until the voting was complete and victory declared, securing Diaz's 7th term as the President of Mexico. Madero fled to Texas, where he committed his personal fortune to stockpiling guns and recruiting an insurgent army to force Diaz from power. Ricardo Flores Magon had been in the United States for 6 years, agitating for revolt. His followers, known as magonistas, had few resources. They were poor men and women, mostly miners, farm workers, and cotton pickers, many of them displaced from Mexico when President Diaz gave their land to foreign investors. They wanted their land back, and they were willing to fight for it. For challenging his rule, the Diaz administration dubbed them malos mexicanos, bad Mexicans. By 1910, Ricardo Flores Magon and the Magonistas had launched a series of attacks on the Diaz regime, including 4 armed raids. When Francisco Madero arrived in the United States and called for a mass uprising against Diaz's rule to begin at 6 p.m. on November 20th, 1910, the Magonistas vowed to join the fight. By November 16th, when Ambassador Wilson met with President Diaz, armed men were mustering on the banks of the Rio Grande. Diaz told Wilson that a revolution was brewing and only the U.S. government could stop it. Unless the American government prevents these men from making an open revolutionary propaganda against the Mexican government, a more serious disturbance might be expected, warned Diaz. U.S. authorities were already monitoring the situation. In Texas, federal agents tailed Francisco Madero, who, they confirmed, was acquiring trainloads of guns and smuggling them across the border. But, according to most U.S. authorities, Madero, a political reformer who was popular among Mexico's middle and upper classes, was not a threat to U.S. interests. After decades of corrupt elections, these wealthier Mexicans sought to oust Diaz from power and restore democratic rule. But they hardly questioned the economic arrangements of the Diaz regime. As Ambassador Wilson put it, a Madero administration would do justice to American interests. U.S. agents did not arrest Madero or his supporters, known as maderistas. Ricardo Flores Magon and the Magonistas, however, were a threat because they sought a wholesale political and economic revolution. They not only demanded Diaz's ouster, they demanded a strict limit on foreign investment in Mexico, protections for workers, and the return of the land seized by investors during the Diaz era to Mexico's dispossessed rural and indigenous communities. It was the Magonistas who made Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, the revolution's battle cry. This platform was intolerable to U.S. investors and the federal government they strongly influenced. U.S. authorities had been hounding the Magonistas for years, ever since Flores Magon first arrived in the United States in January 1904. Brilliant and ill-tempered, Ricardo Flores Magon looked more like a girthy professor than a gutsy revolutionary. On the pages of his Mexico City newspaper, Regeneración, Flores Magon named the Diaz regime a dictatorship, daring to print a word no one else would. General Diaz has killed democracy, declared Flores Magon. Moreover, he insisted Diaz's economic policies had made Mexicans the servants of foreigners. Diaz had Flores Magon arrested numerous times, his printing press smashed by security forces. After fleeing to the United States in 1904, Flores Magon and his small circle of friends found themselves the target of a joint U.S.-Mexico counterinsurgency campaign. The U.S. Departments of State, War, Justice and Commerce and Labor committed dozens of agents, officers, soldiers, and officials, and enormous resources to undermining the Magonista revolt in the United States. The U.S. Marshals, the Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, the U.S. Immigration Service, and the Arizona Rangers participated too, as did police and sheriff departments across the country. The U.S. Postal Service played a particularly important role, providing Mexican authorities and agents with access to Magonista mail, which allowed the counterinsurgency units to hunt down revolutionaries on both sides of the border. The Mexican government also hired a bevy of U.S.-based informants and spies and likely paid off at least one U.S. attorney with a diamond ring. In sum, U.S. agents were responsible for monitoring, tracking, arresting, imprisoning, detaining, deporting, and even kidnapping scores of Mexican revolutionaries in the United States, mostly in the borderlands, where the magonistas maintained a stronghold among the region's Mexican migrant workers. Pressure on the magonistas was not limited to government authorities. The extra-legal forces of white supremacy also rallied against them. Antonio Rodriguez, the man whose murder in Texas set off the conflagration in Mexico, may have been a magonista. He was a revolutionist, whispered the residents of Rock Springs, Texas, after they lynched him. Rodriguez, they said, had not only killed a white woman, but was suspected of being one of the many magonistas known to be traveling the border region, raiding Mexican towns, spreading propaganda, recruiting fighters, and collecting guns for the coming revolt. Against this campaign of coordinated political suppression and racial violence, the magonistas persevered, outrunning and outsmarting the U.S.-Mexico counterinsurgency team. In 1904, Ricardo Flores Magon and the magonistas relaunched Regeneración, which they smuggled to tens of thousands of subscribers on both sides of the border. In 1905, they established a political party, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, PLM, to formally challenge Diaz's rule. In 1906, they built an army. By 1908, the PLM army had launched 4 armed raids on small towns in northern Mexico. The magonistas then began to cultivate the support of Anglo-American radicals, including the labor organizers Mother Jones and Eugene V. Debs and others, instigating a series of political assaults that deeply wounded Diaz's political standing on the world stage. By 1910, the magonistas had primed Mexico for revolt. Ricardo Flores Magon and the magonistas did not go on to lead the revolution's major battles. The PLM's ill-provisioned army lacked the resources needed to lay siege to Diaz. Flores Magon also lacked the will to shift from agitator to military general when the time came to fight, convinced that Mexico's aggrieved masses would spontaneously rise up and storm the dictator's palace once the PLM set the stage for revolt. He was wrong about that. Francisco Madero, Francisco Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and others took the Mexican Revolution through its fighting phase, but it was Flores Magon and the magonistas who opened the road to revolution in Mexico. In so doing, they changed the course of history, both north and south of the border. The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 17, remade Mexico. In 1917, after 7 years of fighting, Mexico adopted a new constitution that restored democratic rule, asserted public ownership of the subsoil, and increased protections for Mexico's poorest citizens, namely wage owners and communal landholders. Ultimately, most of the magonistas' demands were enshrined, although not enforced, in the 1917 Constitution. For their role in inspiring the revolt, Ricardo Flores Magon and the magonistas are widely remembered in Mexico. Historians have anointed them the precursors of the revolution. There are towns, streets, schools, statues, museums, libraries, and even a gym in Mexico named for Flores Magon and the other leaders of the movement. Juan Sabaria, Antonio Villarreal, Enrique Flores Magon, Praxedes Guerrera, and Labrado Rivera. Radicals across Europe and the Americas continue to hold Ricardo Flores Magon in high esteem because he never sacrificed his ideals. Until the day he died, some say he was murdered in a dank cell at Leavenworth Penitentiary. Flores Magon was a rebel. In the 1940s, 20 years after his death, his body was reinterred in Mexico City's Rotunda of Distinguished Men, later renamed the Rotunda of Distinguished Persons, securing his place in Mexican history. The Mexican Revolution also remade the United States. The years of fighting forced more than 1 million Mexicans to flee northward, which radically reoriented U.S. culture, politics, and society by cementing the pathways of mass migration from Mexico and giving rise to the first generation of Mexican Americans. Not even the mass deportation repatriation campaigns executed during the Great Depression could permanently reverse the flow. By 1980, Mexicans had become the largest immigrant group in the United States, ending Europe's long dominance in the U.S. immigration story. By 2010, more immigrants had arrived from Mexico than any other country in U.S. history. Today, Latinos, led by Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, constitute the largest non-white population in the United States. By 2045, the United States is projected to be a minority white nation, with Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants driving the shift. In other words, the 1910 Mexican Revolution is a seminal event in U.S. history. It changed who we are as a people. Yet, few people in the United States know much about the Mexican Revolution, and even less about the men and women who incited it. Typically, the extraordinary story of Ricardo Flores Magon and the Magonistas is folded into the corners of Mexican-American history, which itself is little known in the United States. History textbooks have had little to say on the subject, and until recently, legislators in Arizona all but banned the teaching of Mexican-American studies in K-12 classrooms. Meanwhile, U.S. publishers and film producers persistently struggle to promote Latino voices, content, and experiences. However, as historians of Mexico and the Mexican-American experience have long made clear, you cannot understand U.S. history without Mexico and Mexicans. The history of the United States as a global power cannot be told without Mexico. The U.S. government spent the 19th century charging across the North American continent, launching Indian wars, purchasing European empires, and invading Mexico, all in search of new lands for its white citizens to occupy. Boozed up on the fantasy of manifest destiny, the arriving Anglo-Americans dubbed themselves settlers, and, backed by troops, fought to extinguish indigenous claims to land and life in the region. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. settler state, also branded the white man's republic, claimed a massive strip of land from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific coast. The United States government and its settler citizens continued their territorial exploits in Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and more. But they also began to seriously consider a new kind of expansion: economic and political domination without territorial acquisition. They began this form of expansion in Mexico, under the rule of Porfirio Diaz, buying land, extracting resources, and using labor without directly assuming control over territory or governance. Then, in 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt issued his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted the right and responsibility of the United States to exercise international police power wherever political or economic stability in the Americas seemed threatened. The Diaz regime picked up Roosevelt's big stick, acting as a proxy state to enforce U.S. interests across Latin America. In other words, the expansion of U.S. economic and political might was hatched in Mexico, and from there projected across the Americas, and from there around the world. Diaz's Mexico was the laboratory of U.S. imperialism. Relatedly, the rise of the American West cannot be understood without Mexicans. Foreign investment in Mexico triggered the rise of Mexican labor migration to the United States. Dispossessed in Mexico, millions of Mexicans first migrated within Mexico to towns and cities, factories, haciendas, and mines in search of work. Then they began crossing the border, following the railway lines funded by investors to extract and export Mexico's natural resources. Across the U.S. West, Mexican migrants found plenty of work on the railroads, in copper mines, lumber yards, farms, canneries, and more. By 1920, Mexican labor migrants comprised the American West's single largest low-wage labor force, driving the region's emergence as a global economic powerhouse. But Mexico's labor migrants were not America's immigrants, and their arrival en masse at the beginning of the 20th century opened a new field of race and inequity in the American story. Since the Mexican-American War, 1846–48, Anglo-Americans largely regarded persons of Mexican descent in the United States as conquered, a mixed-race people slotted by manifest destiny to serve settler citizens and fuel their industries, or disappear. Migrating from job to job across the American West, Mexico's labor migrants built the region's industries while running headfirst into a web of white supremacy designed to keep them subservient. They confronted low wages, dangerous working conditions, segregation, and a racially biased immigration enforcement regime, amounting to a system scholars describe as Juan Crow. U.S. settler citizens expected Mexico's labor migrants to bow to the settle order. As Victor S. Clarke, the first Anglo-American economist to study Mexican labor migration to the United States, explained in a 1908 report for the Department of Labor, the Mexican laborer is unambitious, listless, physically weak, irregular, and indolent. On the other hand, he is docile, patient, usually orderly in camp, fairly intelligent under competent supervision, obedient and cheap. If he were active and ambitious, he would be less tractable and would cost more. His strongest point is his willingness to work for a low wage. Victor S. Clarke was wrong. Across the American West, Mexico's labor migrants struck for higher wages, challenged the tenets of Juan Crow, and even joined the magonistas. When they did, the consequences could be brutal. Historians William Kerrigan and Clive Webb have documented that at least 547 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were lynched between 1848 and 1928. They estimated that thousands more were killed without record. Bodies were dumped in the Rio Grande to be swept into the Gulf of Mexico. Corpses were left in the brush to be picked out by crows. Bones were left on the plains to be buried by windstorms. The 1910 killing of Antonio Rodriguez in Rock Springs, Texas, was the 448th such murder on record. No one was arrested. The coroner's report said Rodriguez's body was found burned to a crisp, lying in the ashes. A local judge ruled that Rodriguez came to his death at the hands of parties unknown. The riots and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?